I'm Jessica Mitchell, 27 years old, and I never imagined my own mother would lock me out of my home. Standing there with my suitcase, banging on our front door after a business trip, my world shattered when she finally opened it and said those ice-cold words, "You don't live here anymore." Behind her, Richard's smug face appeared in the shadows, watching my distress with satisfaction. In that moment, I realized the person who should have been my ultimate safety net had become my worst nightmare. What happened next would change both our lives forever. Before I dive into this painful story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against family, and subscribe to join our community of survivors and thrivers. Now, let me take you through the most heartbreaking betrayal I've ever experienced. To understand how I ended up homeless on my own doorstep, you need to know that I'd been living with my mom temporarily while saving for my own place. As a real estate agent in Boston's competitive market, I knew exactly how much I needed to put down on a decent condo, and I was just about 3 months away from my goal. The irony that I helped others find homes while losing my own isn't lost on me. My dad, Michael Mitchell, passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack. We were incredibly close. He taught me everything from how to change a tire to how to negotiate a contract, which later helped in my career. Dad always said I had his business sense and determination. After his funeral, Mom and I clung to each other, grief-stricken and trying to navigate our new normal in the 2-story colonial house he'd lovingly maintained for 20 years. But gradually, something changed in Diana Mitchell. My mother had always been somewhat emotional, but she'd also been caring and supportive throughout my life. After Dad died, a bitterness crept in. She'd make comments about how I looked just like him, but not in the affectionate way she used to. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Something between resentment and pain. "You're just like your father," she'd say when we disagreed about anything, always thinking you know best. I tried to give her space to grieve in her own way. I picked up extra chores around the house, paid for groceries, and contributed to the property taxes. According to my father's will, the house had been left jointly to both of us, a 50-over-50 split that reflected his belief in fairness. He'd always said, "This home belongs to both my girls equally." I treasured that sentiment and never imagined it would become central to a legal battle. Richard Walker entered our lives 6 months ago when Mom joined a grief support group at the community center. He was a widower, or so he claimed, with a smooth way of talking and an answer for everything. From the first time she brought him home, something about him set my teeth on edge. He was too interested in the house, commenting on the prime location and asking detailed questions about the mortgage situation. "Your daughter still lives at home?" he'd asked Mom during that first dinner, eyebrows raised as though I was some kind of parasite. "At her age? That must be challenging for you." The way he positioned himself as Mom's protector was subtle at first. He'd offer to handle repairs around the house that I normally took care of. He'd interrupt conversations between Mom and me, especially if we were discussing finances. Within weeks, he was staying over regularly, and our home's atmosphere changed completely. Mom became secretive, taking phone calls in whispered tones and changing passwords on her accounts. The arguments started small, Mom complaining about my work hours, about dishes left in the sink, about friends who visited. But they escalated quickly after Richard started spending more time at the house. Suddenly, my presence was holding her back from living her life. "When are you planning to get your own place?" became a daily question, despite knowing I was actively saving and had a clear timeline. Richard would chime in with helpful suggestions about cheaper apartments in dangerous neighborhoods or roommate situations that would obviously be inappropriate for someone my age and career status. 2 weeks before the lockout, I landed a major commercial property deal that earned me a substantial commission, enough to finally reach my down payment goal. I was thrilled, planning to start serious house hunting the following month. I told Mom over breakfast, expecting her to be happy for me. "That's nice," she said flatly, not looking up from her coffee. "Richard thinks you should look at that new development across town. The one by the industrial park?" "Mom, That's an hour from my office. She shrugged. Well, beggars can't be choosers. I'm not a beggar, I'd replied, hurt by her dismissal of my achievement. I've worked hard for this. Richard had wandered in then, putting his hand on Mom's shoulder possessively. Your mother has worked hard too, Jessica. For decades. Maybe it's time she got to enjoy her home without a grown child underfoot. That night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. She's almost got enough to move out, Mom was saying. But when? Another month? 2? 5? Richard's voice had an edge to it. Diana, we've talked about this. It's time to start our life together, and she needs to go. She's not a child anymore. I know, but the house is half hers. Michael made sure of that. Legal ownership and right to occupy are different things, he'd replied. Trust me on this. The conversation disturbed me enough that I decided to accelerate my timeline. I scheduled viewings for the following week and took on a business trip to close another deal that would pad my savings even further. The irony was crushing. The very trip that was meant to secure my future independence became the opportunity for them to lock me out completely. Standing on the front porch with my suitcase, exhausted from the 3-day business trip to New York, I initially thought I'd grabbed the wrong key. I tried again, jiggling it in the lock before realizing the key itself was different. The lock had been changed. Confused, I rang the doorbell and knocked. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened just enough for my mother's face to appear. Mom, what's going on? My key doesn't work, I said, relieved to see her. Her expression was stone cold. That's because you don't live here anymore, Jessica. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some terrible joke. What are you talking about? All my stuff is inside. I just got back from the business trip, the one I told you about last week. We packed your things. You can arrange to pick them up later, she replied mechanically. Richard appeared behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Your mother needs her space, Jessica. We've been more than patient. Patient? This is my house, too. Dad left it to both of us. I was starting to panic, the reality of the situation sinking in. You can't just lock me out. At least let me get my clothes, my computer, my work files are in there. You should have thought about that before you decided to take advantage of your mother's generosity all these years, Richard replied smugly. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. We'll contact you about your belongings. Please leave now or we'll have to call the police for trespassing. Trespassing? Mom, my name is on the deed. Dad made sure of that. I was shouting now, tears streaming down my face as neighbors peeked through their windows at the commotion. The door closed in my face. I kept knocking, calling my mother's name, begging for an explanation, until finally I saw blue lights reflected in the windows. Someone, probably Richard, had actually called the police. 2 officers approached cautiously, asking what the disturbance was about. Through tears, I tried to explain my situation. My name is on the deed to this house. My mother and her boyfriend changed the locks while I was away on a business trip. All my possessions are inside. Officer Jenkins, the older of the 2, sighed heavily. Do you have proof of ownership with you? No, it's inside with everything else I own. I just got back from a trip. I wasn't expecting to be homeless. My voice cracked on the last word. Ma'am, if your name is on the deed, you have legal rights to the property, but this sounds like a civil matter. We can't force them to let you in without a court order. His partner spoke to my mother and Richard through the barely open door, then returned. They're claiming you moved out voluntarily and are just causing problems now. That's a lie. I was incredulous. I've lived here since my father died 3 years ago. My name is on the mortgage payments. I have mail delivered here. I'm sorry, but without documentation, there's not much we can do tonight. I suggest you find somewhere to stay and contact a lawyer in the morning. They left me standing there with nothing but my suitcase containing 3 business outfits and a toiletry bag. My laptop, files, personal documents, photos, jewelry, everything I owned, was locked inside a house I legally co-owned. In desperation, I called my best friend Amber, who immediately drove over to pick me up. When she arrived, I was sitting on the curb, shell-shocked. "Jess, what the hell happened?" she asked, helping me with my suitcase. "She locked me out, Amber. My own mother changed the locks and is pretending I don't live there anymore." The words sounded surreal even as I said them. At Amber's apartment, the full weight of the betrayal finally hit me. I collapsed on her couch in tears, alternating between rage and disbelief. How could my mother do this to me? What had Richard convinced her of? Where would I go? How would I work without my files and computer? "I need to call her," I said, reaching for my phone. "This has to be some misunderstanding." But when I dialed my mother's number, it went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again. Text messages went unanswered. It was as though I had ceased to exist in her world. The next morning, Amber took the day off work to accompany me to the police station to file a formal report. The desk sergeant was more sympathetic, but ultimately gave the same answer. Without a court order, they couldn't force entry to the property. "Even if my name is on the deed?" I asked incredulously. "Property disputes between family members are complicated," he explained. "Your best bet is to contact a lawyer immediately." Amber drove me to the house again, thinking perhaps in the daylight, with emotions calmed, my mother would be reasonable. This time, nobody answered the door, though both their cars were in the driveway. Through the windows, I could see stacks of boxes in the living room, presumably my belongings, haphazardly packed. A neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, came out to her porch. "Jessica? What's going on?" "We saw the police last night." I explained the situation briefly, embarrassment coloring my cheeks. "That's terrible," she said, shaking her head. "That man is bad news. Since he started coming around, your mother has changed completely. Last week, she canceled the neighborhood book club she's hosted for 10 years. Said she doesn't have time for nonsense anymore." Those were her exact words. "Has she said anything about me?" I asked. Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated. "She told Martha across the street that you were taking advantage of her and refused to move out. But honey, we've all known you since you were a teenager. Nobody believes that." That afternoon, I met with Laura Barnes, a lawyer specializing in property disputes. After reviewing my situation, she confirmed what I had feared and hoped. As joint owner of the property, I had every legal right to access it. "Your father's will giving you 50% ownership of the house was a smart move," Laura said, reviewing the copy I'd fortunately stored in my email. "They can't legally keep you out or dispose of your property. But getting emergency access might take time, and could get ugly." "I don't understand why she's doing this," I said, my voice breaking. "We were close before Richard came along. Now it's like she's a different person." "Unfortunately, I see this kind of influence happen often," Laura replied sympathetically. "But right now, we need to focus on getting you access to your belongings and asserting your property rights. I'll file an emergency motion tomorrow morning." That night, my mother finally responded to my texts with a single message. "Stop harassing us or we'll get a restraining order. Your things will be in storage by the weekend." I stared at my phone in disbelief, the words blurring through my tears. The mother, who had once bandaged my skinned knees and celebrated my achievements, was now threatening legal action against me. It felt like I had lost both parents, not just my father. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would test every ounce of my strength and redefine what family truly means. The following morning, I met with Laura Barnes again to develop a comprehensive strategy. Her office was warm and inviting, but nothing could ease the hollow feeling in my chest. Laura listened attentively as I provided every detail I could remember about the house, my contributions, and the recent changes in my mother's behavior. "Based on everything you've told me, Jessica, we have several options," Laura explained, arranging documents on her desk. "First, we can file for an emergency order to retrieve your personal belongings. Second, we can assert your right to occupy the property you co-own. Or third, we can pursue what's called a partition action." "What's a partition action?" I asked, the term unfamiliar despite my real estate background. "It's a legal process that forces the sale of jointly owned property when the co-owners can't agree on its use or disposition. Essentially, the court would order the house sold and the proceeds split according to ownership percentage. In your case, 50 over 50. I felt the blood drain from my face. You mean force my mother to sell her home? Laura nodded soberly. It's an aggressive move, but sometimes necessary when joint owners reach an impasse. We don't have to decide on that option immediately. But you should understand all possible paths forward. The thought of forcing my childhood home to be sold felt extreme, almost cruel. Despite everything, this was where my father had built bookshelves for my bedroom, where we'd celebrated countless Christmases, where his memory lived in every corner. Let's start with getting my belongings, I said, not ready to consider such a drastic measure. And maybe my mother will come to her senses once Richard isn't whispering in her ear constantly. Over the next few days, we gathered every document that could strengthen my position. My father's will, clearly stating the 50 over 50 property division, bank statements showing my contributions to the mortgage, property taxes and utilities, mail addressed to me at the house, and my driver's license displaying the address. Laura filed motions for immediate retrieval of personal property and sent formal notices asserting my ownership rights. We also reached out to a locksmith who specialized in legal property disputes, someone who could help me enter my home lawfully once we had the proper documentation. While waiting for legal wheels to turn, I stayed at Amber's place, sleeping on her couch and trying to rebuild my work life without my files. My broker was understanding but concerned about potential delays with clients. I had to borrow Amber's laptop for emails and spent hours recreating documents from memory. Just as things couldn't seem worse, they did. A mutual friend called to tell me they'd seen Richard at a local pawn shop, selling what looked like my grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom my father had given me on my 21st birthday. He was also carrying a box of electronics, my friend added. I saw your engraved iPad in there. I tried to say something, but he rushed out when he spotted me. The news sent me into a panic. They were selling my belongings. I called Laura immediately, who advised me to file a police report for theft. We need to document everything, she insisted. And Jessica, I hate to say this, but we should consider that partition action sooner rather than later. They're escalating, and at this rate, you may not have much left to recover. That same day, I received threatening text messages from an unknown number, which I suspected was Richard using a burner phone. Stop making trouble or things will get worse for you. Your mother wants you gone for good. My neighbors became unexpected allies. Mrs. Peterson from next door called to tell me Richard had been approaching people on the street, spreading stories that I had stolen money from my mother and was unstable. Nobody believes him, dear, she assured me. We all remember how you took care of your mother after your father passed. I broke down during a lunch with Amber, overwhelmed by the betrayal and public humiliation. I don't understand how she could choose him over me, I sobbed. What did I do wrong? You did nothing wrong, Amber insisted, squeezing my hand. This is about Richard isolating your mother and getting control of assets. It's textbook manipulation. That evening, I sat alone in Amber's living room, staring at photos of happier times with my parents. My father smiling proudly at my college graduation. My mother hugging me after I sold my first house. How had we gone from that to this? After hours of soul-searching, I made a decision. I would give my mother one final chance to resolve this reasonably before pursuing the partition action. Not for Richard's sake, certainly not for legal expedience, but for the mother I remembered, the woman who must still exist somewhere beneath Richard's influence. I drafted a letter explaining my position clearly but compassionately, outlining a compromise where I would move out permanently within 30 days if allowed to retrieve all my belongings and given time to find suitable housing. I reminded her of our shared grief over Dad, our support of each other, and my willingness to maintain our relationship despite recent events. Mom, I wrote in closing, whatever has come between us, we're still family. Dad would want us to work this out with love and respect. Please meet me halfway. As Laura filed our legal motions, I held onto a thin hope that my mother would remember who she was before Richard, before grief twisted her heart against me. But deep down, I was beginning to accept that I might have to fight harder than I ever imagined for what was legally and morally mine. With my heartfelt letter complete, I asked Laura to review it before sending. She suggested a few clarifications on the legal points, but agreed that offering a reasonable compromise was worth trying. This shows good faith, she noted. If we do end up in court, the judge will see you made genuine efforts to resolve the situation amicably. I mailed the letter certified with return receipt requested, ensuring my mother would have to sign for it personally. Then I waited, hoping against hope for a positive response. 3 days later, the receipt came back with her signature, but no word from her directly. After a week of silence, I suggested meeting at Riverside Cafe, a neutral location where we'd often had mother-daughter lunches in happier times. I sent the invitation by text, email, and through a card delivered by courier. The date arrived, and I sat at our usual table by the window, watching the door with every chime of the bell. She never came. After waiting 90 minutes, I finally accepted that she wasn't going to show. As I paid for my untouched coffee, Teresa, our regular waitress, approached awkwardly. "Jessica, I don't know if this helps, but your mom was here earlier. I saw her park across the street about 20 minutes before your reservation." She sat in her car for a while, then a man pulled up beside her. They talked, and then she drove away with him. Richard had intercepted her. The realization sent a chill through me. The next day brought a new, devastating blow. I received a notification from my bank about unusual activity and discovered that my mother had withdrawn nearly $15,000 from our joint savings account, money I'd been setting aside for my house down payment. Since both our names were on the account, the withdrawal was perfectly legal, if morally reprehensible. When I called Laura in a panic, she wasn't surprised. Unfortunately, this is common in these situations. We should have closed joint accounts immediately. Let's get that done today with any remaining assets. But why would she do this? I asked, still struggling to reconcile this behavior with the mother I thought I knew. She knows how hard I worked for that money. From what you've told me about Richard, he's likely convincing her that she's entitled to it, perhaps as compensation for housing you. People under manipulative influence often justify actions they'd normally find unthinkable. Through a friend of a friend, I learned that Richard had a history I hadn't known about. He'd been involved with at least 2 other widows in neighboring towns over the past 5 years, relationships that ended after financial entanglements. Nothing had resulted in criminal charges, but there were civil complaints that had been settled quietly. I tried reaching out to my Aunt Karen, my mother's sister, hoping she might serve as an intermediary. Instead of support, I met with unexpected hostility. "Your mother has told me everything," she said coldly over the phone. "How you've been freeloading, refusing to move out, making demands. After everything she's done for you, this is how you repay her? By threatening to force her out of her home?" "Aunt Karen, that's not true. I've been contributing to the household expenses. The house is legally half mine from Dad's will. And I was actively saving to move out when they changed the locks." "Well, that's not what Diana says. She says Richard has been a godsend, helping her see how you've been taking advantage." She paused. "Jessica, sometimes we need to look at ourselves honestly. Your mother deserves happiness after losing Michael." It was clear Richard had poisoned that well, too. I ended the call feeling even more isolated. A small ray of hope appeared when Mrs. Peterson, our neighbor for over 15 years, reached out to me. She invited me for tea and shared disturbing observations. "Your mother barely leaves the house anymore, Jessica. When she does, Richard is always with her. The few times I've seen her alone and tried to talk, she seems nervous, checking her watch constantly. Last week I mentioned your name, and she nearly jumped out of her skin." Mrs. Peterson lowered her voice. "I've seen this before with my sister. Her husband isolated her from everyone. It started with family, then friends. Classic, controlling behavior." This information reinforced my growing concern that this wasn't just about me or the house. My mother might be in a genuinely unhealthy, potentially abusive situation. Meanwhile, Laura's formal request for property access was returned unopened, the envelope stamped refused. Our motion for emergency retrieval of belongings was granted, but when the court officer arrived to supervise, they found many of my more valuable possessions already gone, including my laptop, jewelry, and family heirlooms. The final straw came when I discovered that my mother had created a Facebook post claiming I had abandoned her after my father's death, only returning to steal what was rightfully hers. Mutual friends forwarded screenshots, concerned about the uncharacteristic public attack. The post had Richard's fingerprints all over it, phrases and accusations that mirrored his earlier statements. At work, my performance was suffering noticeably. My broker, Jim, called me into his office after I missed a client meeting, something that had never happened before. "Jessica, you've been one of my top agents for 3 years," he said kindly. "But lately, you're distracted, missing appointments, forgetting details. Clients are noticing. What's going on?" I broke down and explained the situation. To my surprise, Jim was incredibly supportive, offering to advance my next commission to help with legal fees and temporary housing. "Take next week off," he insisted. "Get your personal situation stabilized. Your clients and listings will be here when you get back." His kindness only highlighted the cruelty of my mother's betrayal. The breaking point came when I learned through the grapevine that my mother and Richard were planning to put the house on the market, my childhood home, my legal property, without my knowledge or consent. They had apparently contacted a real estate agent from a competing firm for a valuation. That evening, sitting in Amber's apartment, surrounded by the few possessions I had left, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called Laura. "File the partition action," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "They've left me no choice." The morning Laura filed the partition action, I felt physically ill. The legal document was straightforward. Jessica Mitchell versus Diana Mitchell. Case number 2022 CV 4587, Suffolk County Superior Court. Seeing our names opposed like enemies on an official court document made the nightmare real in a new, painful way. "What happens now?" I asked Laura as we left the courthouse. "The clerk will process the filing today. Your mother will be served with papers, probably tomorrow. Then she'll have 21 days to respond," Laura explained. "Most likely, she'll hire an attorney who will file an answer to our complaint. And then we enter the discovery phase, exchanging information, taking depositions. Eventually, we'll have a hearing where a judge will determine if partition is appropriate, which in your case is very likely given the clear 50/50 ownership and the current dispute." Sure enough, 2 days later, my mother's response came through an aggressive attorney named Harold Winters. His reputation for scorched-earth litigation tactics preceded him. The answer to our complaint denied all wrongdoing, claimed I had abandoned the property voluntarily, and even had the audacity to demand that I pay fair market rent for the time I had lived in Miss Diana Mitchell's home. Our first court appearance was scheduled for 3 weeks later. I spent that time gathering every possible document that might help my case. Photographs of my bedroom and home office showing permanent residence, statements from neighbors confirming my continuous occupancy, receipts for household contributions, even birthday cards from my mother addressing me at that house. The initial hearing was brief but intense. Judge Eleanor Martinez, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, reviewed both filings with a critical eye. "Miss Mitchell, the younger," she clarified, looking at me, "your claim to half ownership seems well documented through your father's will. Miss Mitchell, the elder," she turned to my mother, who wouldn't meet my eyes, "do you dispute that your daughter is legal co-owner of the property?" My mother's attorney stepped forward. "Your Honor, while the will did leave technical ownership to both parties, my client has been the primary resident and caretaker of the property for decades. The plaintiff's occupancy was meant to be temporary and—" "Counselor," Judge Martinez interrupted. "I asked a specific question. Does your client dispute the 50/50 ownership split?" A pause. "No, Your Honor, but—" "Then we have established ownership. Now we need to determine if partition is appropriate. She turned to Laura. Counselor Barnes, why does your client believe partition is the only remedy here? Laura outlined our case concisely. The lockout, the selling of my belongings, the withdrawal of joint funds, and the failed attempts at reconciliation. Then came the bombshell. During cross-examination, Richard was called as a witness regarding his role in the situation. Under pressure from Laura's careful questioning, he inadvertently revealed he had been previously arrested for financial elder abuse in another county, a fact he had hidden from my mother and which had been sealed in court records. The courtroom fell silent. I looked at my mother, whose face had gone ashen. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of the woman I knew. Confused, perhaps even frightened. Richard reached for her hand, but she pulled away slightly. It was the first crack in the facade I'd seen. Judge Martinez ordered a professional appraisal of the property to be paid from potential proceeds before distribution. She also granted me supervised access to retrieve my remaining personal belongings, with a court officer present to prevent further disputes. The next weekend, I returned to my childhood home with a court officer and 2 friends as witnesses. The house I entered barely resembled the warm home I remembered. Many rooms had been rearranged, family photos removed, even the color scheme changed in some areas. My bedroom had been completely transformed into a home gym, with my remaining possessions piled in boxes in the garage. Richard hovered throughout the process, whispering to my mother and objecting to nearly every item I claimed. The court officer had to intervene repeatedly. That jewelry box was a gift to Diana, Richard insisted, when I reached for my grandmother's antique case. Sir, the officer said firmly, unless you have documentation that this item belongs to Miss Diana Mitchell specifically, Miss Jessica Mitchell is permitted to take her personal belongings. I noticed water damage in several areas that hadn't existed before, a suspicious development just before an appraisal. When I pointed this out to the court officer, he documented it thoroughly, taking photographs for the record. Has anyone been making repairs or alterations to the property recently? He asked my mother. She looked at Richard before answering. Richard has been helping with some renovations. Renovations that coincidentally reduce the property value right before an appraisal? I asked, unable to contain myself. That's enough, Jessica, my mother snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. The court-appointed mediator assigned to our case attempted a resolution session the following week, but it ended quickly when Richard repeatedly interrupted and made demands far outside legal norms. My client is willing to buy out Jessica's share at 20% of valuation, considering the years of free housing she's enjoyed, Richard stated, apparently functioning as some kind of amateur legal advisor alongside my mother's actual attorney. Laura didn't bother hiding her contempt. That offer isn't even worth responding to. The ownership is 50/50, and market value is market value. When the mediator asked to speak with my mother alone, Richard objected vehemently. The session ended without progress, but it confirmed my suspicion. Richard was afraid of my mother speaking to anyone without his influence. As we left the mediation, Laura squeezed my shoulder. That actually went well for us, she said quietly. The mediator saw exactly what's happening here. That will go in her report to the judge. The professional appraisal came in higher than expected, despite the recent water damage. The colonial-style home in our desirable neighborhood had appreciated significantly since my father purchased it, and even with the suspicious damage, it was worth nearly $850,000. When this figure was presented in court, I saw Richard's expression change. A flash of calculation crossed his face as he leaned to whisper something to my mother. For the first time, I wondered if his entire plan had been aimed at getting his hands on the property all along. The judge reviewed the appraisal report and noted the documented attempt to devalue the property. The court takes a very dim view of parties attempting to manipulate asset values during litigation, she warned, looking directly at Richard. She then ruled decisively. Given the clear co-ownership, the demonstrated inability of the parties to cooperate in managing the property, and the documented exclusion of one owner from her legal interest, I find that partition by sale is appropriate in this case. The property shall be listed with a court-approved real estate agent within 30 days, sold at fair market value, and proceeds divided equally between the co-owners after expenses. My mother gasped audibly. Richard's face darkened with anger. I felt no triumph, only a hollow vindication and lingering sadness that it had come to this. As we left the courtroom, I overheard Richard hissing at my mother. "This is your fault. If you'd handled her properly from the beginning." My mother pulled away from him, looking suddenly older and uncertain. Our eyes met briefly across the corridor, and for a moment I thought she might speak to me. Then Richard took her arm firmly, and they walked away. Laura patted my back gently. "It's the right outcome legally, Jessica. I know it doesn't feel like a victory." "It doesn't," I agreed, "but at least it's almost over." Little did I know, the drama was far from finished, and the most shocking betrayal was yet to come. With the court ordering the sale of the house, I thought the worst was behind us. The property was listed with a court-approved agent, and showings began immediately in the hot Boston market. I tried to distance myself emotionally, focusing instead on finding my own place with the anticipated proceeds. However, something about Richard's reaction to the ruling bothered me. Rather than being angry about losing the house, he seemed almost calculating, as if adjusting to a new phase of some larger plan. It made me uneasy enough to mention it to Laura. "Trust your instincts," she advised. "Would you feel better if we looked into his background more thoroughly?" I decided to hire Martin Reeves, a private investigator Laura recommended. Though it felt extreme, my concern for my mother outweighed my hesitation. "Focus on his financial connections to my mother," I instructed. "Something doesn't add up." While waiting for Martin's findings, I threw myself into work, trying to rebuild my client base after the disruption. One evening, I was showing a property near my mother's neighborhood when I spotted Richard's car outside a notary office. Curious, I finished my showing quickly and drove back, parking across the street. 20 minutes later, my mother and Richard emerged. She looked pale and withdrawn, clutching a folder of documents. Richard was smiling broadly, his arm around her shoulders, in what appeared possessive rather than affectionate. I snapped a quick photo with my phone and sent it to Martin, asking him to look into what documents might have been notarized that day. 2 days later, Martin requested an urgent meeting. When I arrived at his office, his expression was grim. "Jessica, I've found some disturbing information," he began, spreading documents across his desk. "First, Richard Walker has a pattern. He's targeted at least 4 women in the past decade, all widows with significant assets. He establishes relationships, isolates them from family, then gradually gains control of their finances." He showed me records of Richard's previous addresses, overlapping with complaints filed by family members of elderly women. None had resulted in criminal charges. The women themselves had refused to cooperate with investigations. "But here's what's most concerning," Martin continued, pointing to recent financial records. "Your mother has systematically transferred assets to joint accounts with Richard over the past 5 months. Retirement savings, investment accounts, even her car title now lists him as co-owner." I felt physically ill. "How much are we talking about?" "Based on what I've found, nearly $275,000 in liquid assets, plus the car and other valuables." "But that's almost everything she has besides the house," I exclaimed. "Exactly. And here's the bombshell. Yesterday, she executed a new will naming Richard as her sole beneficiary. You've been completely written out." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not just the disinheritance itself, but the timing, immediately after the house sale was ordered. It couldn't be coincidence. "He's planning to take everything," I whispered, the pattern suddenly clear. "Once the house sells and she gets her half of the proceeds." Martin nodded grimly. "It fits his pattern. Get control of assets, then disappear once they're secured." In previous cases, he moved on within weeks of major financial transfers. Though devastated by this confirmation of Richard's true nature, my concerns shifted entirely to my mother's welfare. This wasn't just about the house or money anymore. She was in danger of losing everything to a predator. I took the evidence to Laura, who agreed the situation had escalated beyond our original case. "We need to present this to the judge," she said, reviewing Martin's findings. "This could constitute elder financial abuse, especially given Richard's history." "She's only 61, I pointed out. "Not elderly by legal standards. But she's potentially vulnerable due to grief and manipulation. The pattern is clear enough that Adult Protective Services might investigate." We filed an emergency motion with Judge Martinez, requesting a freeze on the proceeds from the house sale, pending investigation into potential financial exploitation. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, but fate intervened before then. I was grocery shopping when I literally bumped carts with Richard in the produce section. His surprise quickly turned to smug satisfaction. "Well, if it isn't the daughter of the year," he said sarcastically. "Enjoying your victory? Forcing your poor mother out of her home must feel great." I struggled to remain calm. "Richard, I know what you're doing. The other widows, the asset transfers, the new will, it won't work." His expression flickered momentarily before he recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about. Diana and I are building a life together, something you tried to prevent with your selfishness." "Is that why you're already looking at properties in Florida?" I asked, referencing information from Martin's report. "Planning a nice retirement with my mother's money?" "You don't know anything," he snapped, his facade cracking. "Diana sees you for what you are now, a spoiled brat who can't stand seeing her mother happy with someone new." "Happy?" I laughed bitterly. "She looks miserable, Richard. And she won't be happy when she discovers you've done this same con to at least 4 other women." His face darkened dangerously. "You stupid girl. Your mother signed everything willingly. It's all legal. You can't stop anything." "We'll see about that," I replied, noticing a familiar figure at the end of the aisle. My mother stood frozen, a shopping basket hanging from her arm, clearly having overheard our exchange. "Mom," I said softly, taking a step toward her. Richard spun around, his expression instantly transforming. "Diana! I was just telling Jessica how excited we are about our plans." My mother looked between us, confusion and doubt clouding her face. "What was she saying about other women, Richard?" "Nonsense," he said dismissively. "Lies to try to come between us, like I told you she would." I seized the moment. "Mom, I have proof. Bank records, previous complaints, his history with other widows. Please, just look at the evidence before you let him take everything." Richard grabbed my mother's arm. "We're leaving. Now." For the first time, I saw my mother pull away from him forcefully. "No, I want to hear what she's talking about." "She's manipulating you," Richard insisted, his voice rising. "After everything I've done for you, I protected you from her taking advantage, showed you how she was using you all these years." People were staring now. A store manager approached cautiously. "Is everything all right here?" My mother straightened her shoulders, a flash of her former self emerging. "No, it's not." She turned to me. "Jessica, what evidence do you have?" Richard's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful bitch," he spat, shocking us both with the sudden venom. "After I wasted months on you." The store manager stepped between us. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." As Richard was escorted out, shouting threats and obscenities, my mother and I stood in stunned silence. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the true character beneath. "I have everything in my car," I said quietly. "Bank records, police reports, testimonials from other families. Will you at least look at it?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Yes, I think it's time I did." We sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, the evidence spread across the dashboard. As my mother reviewed Martin's findings, years seemed to melt away from her face, replaced by dawning horror and shame. "He said you were trying to take the house to sell it for yourself," she whispered. "That you never contributed, that you were using me. He had explanations for everything. The joint accounts were for my protection. The will was standard estate planning. Mom, he isolated you from everyone who cared about you. That's what predators do. She covered her face with her hands. What have I done? What have I done to you? It was the first genuine moment between us in months. A small crack in the wall that had been built. Though reconciliation was still distant, we had taken the first step away from the abyss Richard had been leading her toward. The next day, my mother visited Laura's office, bringing her financial records and a determination to undo the damage. Together, we developed a plan to protect her remaining assets and gather evidence for potential legal action against Richard. It won't be easy to recover everything, Laura warned. But we can stop any further losses and document the undue influence for the court. My mother nodded, a new resolve in her expression. I need to fix what I've done. To my finances and to my daughter. She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. Jessica, I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know I'm going to try to make this right. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, not yet. Too much had been broken between us. But it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild what Richard had so methodically destroyed. The court-ordered sale of our family home proceeded quickly. The colonial-style house, with its mature maple trees and wraparound porch, had been well maintained despite Richard's sabotage attempts, and in Boston's competitive market, it received multiple offers within days of listing. Given my real estate experience, I couldn't help monitoring the process closely. When I noticed the listing agent recommending an offer that wasn't actually the best, I had Laura intervene. Judge Martinez appointed an independent real estate consultant who confirmed my assessment. The highest offer had better terms and fewer contingencies. The property will sell to the Morgenstern family for $875,000, Judge Martinez ruled. Proceeds to be held in escrow until closing, then divided equally between the co-owners after expenses and fees. Richard's reaction to this development was predictable but still shocking. According to my mother, he became increasingly agitated as the closing date approached, pressuring her to transfer her expected proceeds to their joint account for safekeeping and talking about immediate plans to relocate to Florida. He already had a condo picked out, my mother told me during one of our cautious coffee meetings. Kept showing me pictures, saying we'd be starting fresh away from all the negative influences here. She stared into her cup, meaning you and anyone else who might question him. The day before closing, Richard made his ultimate move. My mother called me in tears, barely coherent. He's gone, Jessica. He took everything. I rushed to her temporary apartment to find her sitting amidst open drawers and ransacked closets. Richard had cleared out while she was at a doctor's appointment, taking her jewelry, electronics, the cash she kept in her desk, even the new car they'd purchased together with the title in both their names. Most devastatingly, he had withdrawn nearly $45,000 from their joint accounts, money my mother had transferred there, at his urging from her retirement savings. He left behind a coldly calculating note. You chose your daughter over me. Enjoy having nothing. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. You tried to warn me. Everyone tried to warn me. I contacted the police immediately, but as the officer explained, it was a complex situation. Since they were not married, but Richard's name was on the accounts and vehicle title, proving theft would be challenging. We'll file the report and investigate, the officer assured us. But honestly, in these situations, the money is usually gone before we can freeze accounts. Laura helped us file emergency motions to prevent Richard from accessing the house sale proceeds, which thankfully were still in escrow. We also reported the financial abuse to Adult Protective Services and sought restraining orders based on Richard's threatening behavior and financial exploitation. The closing proceeded the next day. Our family home of 20 years passed to new owners, a young couple with 2 small children who reminded me of my own family when we'd first moved in. I signed the papers with mixed emotions, grief for what was lost, relief that this chapter was ending, uncertainty about what would follow. When the funds were released a week later, My portion went directly to my account as planned. But by then, we had discovered the full extent of Richard's betrayal. Beyond the cash and valuables he'd taken, he had racked up nearly $30,000 in credit card debt in my mother's name, opened during their relationship for household expenses. He had also convinced her to liquidate most of her retirement accounts, incurring substantial early withdrawal penalties and tax liabilities. I trusted him completely, my mother said, looking shell-shocked as we reviewed her financial situation with a counselor from Adult Protective Services. Every time I questioned anything, he had an answer that seemed to make sense at the time. He said the credit cards were for building our new life together, that retirement accounts were too risky in the current economy. The financial devastation was just beginning to sink in. At 61, my mother had lost nearly 2/3 of her life savings. The house proceeds would help, but they wouldn't fully restore what was taken. Worse, her credit was severely damaged, limiting her housing options going forward. As predicted, Richard had disappeared completely. The police discovered he had left the state, likely headed for Florida as planned, but without my mother's funds to trace, locating him was not a priority for already stretched resources. The aftermath of Richard's departure triggered a health crisis for my mother. Years of stress, followed by the shock of betrayal and financial ruin, culminated in her hospitalization for dangerously high blood pressure and symptoms resembling a mild stroke. Sitting beside her hospital bed, I barely recognized the strong woman who had raised me. She seemed to have aged a decade in months, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the water glass. "I've made such a mess of everything," she whispered. "Your father would be so ashamed of me. Dad would be angry at Richard, not you," I replied, surprised by my own instinct to comfort her despite everything. "But I chose him over you," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "My own daughter, I locked you out of your home. I believed horrible things about you because he told me to. How can you even stand to be here with me?" I didn't have a simple answer. The wounds were still raw, the betrayal still stinging. But seeing her so diminished, so thoroughly victimized by the same man who had driven a wedge between us, I found my anger shifting primarily toward Richard rather than her. "You were manipulated by someone who's done this before," I said finally. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it helps me understand it wasn't really you making those decisions." After her release from the hospital, my mother faced the harsh reality of her new circumstances. With limited funds, poor credit, and ongoing health concerns, her housing options were both expensive and inadequate. The apartment she could afford was in a poorly maintained building far from her doctors and support system. Meanwhile, I had closed on a small duplex in a nice neighborhood, using my portion of the house proceeds as a down payment. The property needed some work, but it was structurally sound with good investment potential, one unit to live in, one to rent for additional income. As a real estate agent, I'd recognized the opportunity immediately. Standing in my new home, surveying the empty rooms that held both possibility and loneliness, I made a decision that would surprise even me. I called my mother. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think before answering," I said carefully. "Would having your own space, completely separate but close by, help your recovery?" The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Jessica," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "after everything that happened, how could you possibly want me anywhere near you?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself repeatedly. The answer wasn't simple, but it was clear. Because despite everything, you're still my mother. And right now, we both need to heal. 3 weeks after my mother's hospital discharge, I drove past her new apartment building and felt my stomach knot with concern. The neighborhood had deteriorated since I'd last visited this area for a property listing, with multiple storefronts now boarded up and trash accumulating on street corners. Her building itself had chipping paint, a broken security door, and a lobby that smelled of mildew. She had insisted she was getting settled during our brief phone conversations, but something in her voice sounded hollow. After Richard's betrayal and the loss of her home, this final indignity living in substandard conditions after decades in her beautiful colonial seemed particularly cruel. I hesitated before calling Amber to discuss my growing concern. Despite everything, Amber had been my rock throughout the ordeal, but I knew she still harbored anger toward my mother. "I don't know what to do," I admitted when we met for coffee. "She sounds worse every time we talk. The apartment is awful. Her doctor says her blood pressure isn't stabilizing." But after everything that happened, Amber stirred her latte thoughtfully. "You know, my grandmother used to say that forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It's about refusing to carry the burden of anger yourself." She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not out of guilt." My friend Trevor, who had helped me move into the duplex, offered another perspective. "From what you've told me, your mom was basically brainwashed by this guy. It doesn't excuse what she did, but maybe it explains it. People in cults do crazy things too, but we don't blame them as much as the cult leaders." These conversations circled in my mind as I finally gathered the courage to visit my mother's apartment in person. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. Always meticulously put together throughout my childhood, she now wore a stained housecoat, her hair unwashed, the apartment behind her cluttered and neglected. "Jessica," she said, genuine surprise in her voice. "I wasn't expecting you." "I was worried," I replied simply. "Can I come in?" The small apartment was worse than I'd feared, not just untidy but barely functional. The refrigerator held little beyond condiments and a carton of spoiled milk. Mail was piled unopened on the table, including what looked like medical bills and bank notices. A persistent drip sounded from the bathroom, where black mold crept along the shower tiles. "Mom," I said carefully, "have you been eating?" She waved dismissively. "I'm not very hungry these days." I opened a few cupboards to find them nearly bare. "When did you last see your doctor?" "I missed my last appointment," she admitted. "The bus schedule is complicated, and a taxi costs too much." As we talked, the extent of her isolation became clear. After Richard, she felt too ashamed to reconnect with old friends. Her sister, my Aunt Karen, had apologized for her role in the family rift, but lived across the country. With no car and limited mobility in this neighborhood, my mother had essentially become a prisoner in her dismal apartment. I made us both tea in chipped mugs, sitting across from her at the wobbly kitchen table. For a long while, we sipped in silence, the weight of our shared and separate traumas hanging between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know sorry doesn't begin to cover what I did to you." "It doesn't," I agreed quietly. "But it's somewhere to start." She nodded, tears welling. "I've gone over and over it in my mind, trying to understand how I could have been so blind. After your father died, there was this emptiness. Richard seemed to know exactly how to fill it, exactly what to say." She twisted her wedding ring, which she still wore despite everything. "He made me feel taken care of again, protected." "But he was actually isolating me, wasn't he?" "That's how these people operate," I said. "They target vulnerabilities, find the cracks and widen them. The things he said about you," she continued, shaking her head, "they seemed so convincing at the time that you were using me, taking advantage. That you'd always been jealous of my relationship with your father." She looked up, anguish plain on her face. "How could I have believed such terrible things about my own daughter?" "Because he spent months conditioning you to believe them," I replied, like boiling a frog slowly. And I hesitated, knowing this truth might hurt but needing to say it. "Because after Dad died, there was already distance between us. Richard exploited that." She nodded slowly. "After Michael died, seeing you was sometimes painful. You look so much like him. Have his mannerisms, his laugh." Richard noticed that reaction and used it against both of us. The admission didn't erase the pain, but it helped make sense of it. There had been a foundation of grief and unprocessed emotion that made Richard's manipulation possible. Understanding this didn't justify what had happened, but it provided context that felt important for moving forward. As I prepared to leave, I noticed my mother's prescription bottles lined up on the counter, several of them empty. "Have you refilled these?" I asked, concerned. She shook her head. "The copays went up. I'm waiting until next month." The reality of her situation crystallized for me in that moment. Beyond the emotional damage and broken trust between us lay a practical, immediate crisis. My mother was genuinely struggling to survive, physically, financially, emotionally. Through Aunt Karen, who had finally recognized Richard's true nature after he disappeared with my mother's money, I learned even more troubling details. My mother had been skipping meals to pay rent, had sold her wedding ring despite still wearing the cheap replica, and had been showing signs of significant depression. "She won't ask for help," Aunt Karen told me over the phone. "She feels she doesn't deserve it after what happened. But I'm worried about her, Jessica. Really worried." I drove home to my half-furnished duplex, thinking about the empty second unit. I'd planned to rent it out for additional income, had already started interviewing potential tenants, but another possibility kept intruding on these plans. That night, I sat alone in my living room, making two lists. The first contained all the reasons to keep my distance: the betrayal, the locked doors, the stolen possessions, the court battle, the cruel words, the shattered trust. The second list was shorter but weighed just as heavily. She was manipulated by a predator. She was genuinely remorseful. She was family. She was in crisis. And most importantly, helping her would also help me move forward. The next morning, I called Laura for legal advice before making any decisions. "I'm considering offering my mother the second unit in my duplex," I explained. "But I need to protect myself legally. After everything that happened." "I understand completely," Laura assured me. "We could draw up a formal lease agreement with very specific terms: separate utilities, clear boundaries about common areas, explicit statements about ownership and property rights. It would be a landlord-tenant relationship on paper, whatever your personal arrangement might be." "And if things went badly again?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. "The agreement would include conditions for termination." "You'd have clear legal recourse this time," Laura said. "Jessica, this is incredibly generous considering what you've been through. But I want to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons." It was a question I'd been asking myself repeatedly. Was this about guilt, obligation, or something more fundamental about who I wanted to be and the relationship I hoped might still be salvaged? After another week of consideration and consultation with friends, I finally called my mother with the proposal. "I have the second unit in my duplex," I explained carefully. "It's separate, with its own entrance and utilities. It's close to your doctor's, on a bus line, and in a safe neighborhood." I took a deep breath. "If you want it, it's yours. We'd have a formal lease. There would be conditions and boundaries, but you wouldn't have to live in that apartment anymore." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if she'd hung up. "Why would you do this?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. "After everything I did?" It was the question I'd been wrestling with myself. "Because holding on to anger is exhausting," I said simply. "Because you were a good mother for most of my life, before Richard. Because I think we both deserve a chance to heal. And because Dad would want us to try." She began to cry softly. "I don't deserve this kindness from you." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But I'm offering it anyway. Not because you earned it, but because I choose to give it." We agreed to meet with Laura to draw up the formal agreement. As difficult as the conversation had been, I felt lighter afterward, not because everything was fixed, but because I had made a choice that aligned with my own values rather than my pain. The path to reconciliation would be neither quick nor easy. Trust, once shattered, doesn't simply reassemble without showing cracks. But in offering this opportunity, I had opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. What happened next would depend on both of us walking through it with honesty, boundaries, and cautious hope. 1 year after the court battle that divided our family home, I stood in my backyard watching my mother carefully tending to the herb garden she had planted. The transformation in her was remarkable: physically stronger, emotionally more stable. her eyes clear and focused as she worked methodically among the fragrant plants. The journey to this point had been neither simple nor linear. When she first moved into the second unit of my duplex 6 months ago, our interactions were strained and formal. We communicated primarily through notes and texts, carefully maintaining the boundaries established in our legal agreement. The duplex arrangement provided exactly what we both needed: proximity without forced intimacy, independence with a safety net, and most importantly, time and space to rebuild what had been broken. The separate entrances and divided yard areas allowed us to establish our own routines and privacy while living close enough to help each other when needed. My mother had initially been reluctant to accept even the smallest kindness, her shame about her actions under Richard's influence creating a barrier to receiving help. It took weeks before she would join me for a simple cup of coffee in the shared garden space between our units. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she admitted during one of those early, awkward conversations. "For you to realize you've made a mistake letting me be here." "This arrangement works for both of us," I reminded her. "The rent you pay helps with my mortgage. You're close to your doctors and therapy appointments. It's practical for both of us." While that was true, we both knew this living arrangement was about much more than practicality. It was about redemption, healing, and the painful process of rebuilding trust. The first major breakthrough came unexpectedly. 3 months after she moved in, I contracted a severe case of flu that left me bedridden for days. Despite our careful boundaries, my mother stepped in without hesitation, leaving homemade soup outside my door, picking up my prescriptions, and even handling a client call when I was too ill to reach my phone. When I recovered, something had shifted between us. The wall of formality had developed its first significant crack. "Thank you for taking care of me," I said when I was well enough to visit her unit. "You used to get sick like that as a child," she replied softly. "Your father and I would take turns sitting with you through the night." Her eyes grew distant with the memory. "He was always so worried when your fever spiked. He'd read to you for hours to keep you distracted." It was the first time since everything happened that she had mentioned my father without visible guilt or pain. Just a simple, warm memory shared between us. Gradually, other memories resurfaced. Untainted ones from before Richard, before grief had driven us apart. We began to cautiously reconstruct our history together, separating the genuine bonds from the manipulated narratives Richard had created. My mother's therapy played a crucial role in her recovery. Her therapist, Dr. Martinez, specialized in helping victims of psychological manipulation and financial abuse. Through this work, my mother began to understand how Richard had systematically exploited her grief and insecurities to isolate and control her. "Dr. Martinez says what happened to me is actually common," she explained one evening as we shared dinner in my unit. "Another small step toward normalcy. Predators like Richard target people in transition or grief. They're experts at finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them." Understanding the mechanics of the manipulation helped us both process what had happened without excusing it. The therapy also helped my mother recognize the warning signs to prevent future exploitation. Professionally, I continued to thrive, eventually becoming a partner at my real estate firm. The experience with the house partition, painful as it was, had given me unique insight into property disputes and family real estate issues. I developed a specialty in helping clients navigate complex property divisions during divorces and estate settlements, turning my personal trauma into professional expertise. My mother, meanwhile, found purpose through volunteer work with a local organization that educated seniors about financial scams and exploitation. Her willingness to share her experience, however humiliating, helped others recognize the warning signs she had missed. The work gave her confidence and community connection that had been lacking since my father's death. The recovery of some of my sentimental belongings came unexpectedly. A pawn shop owner contacted me after police circulated information about items Richard had stolen. He had recognized my grandmother's pearl necklace from the description and held it aside instead of reselling it. Though many items remained lost, Recovering this precious heirloom felt symbolic of the larger healing taking place. 6 months into our new living arrangement, my mother handed me a carefully wrapped package. "I've been saving to replace some of what was lost," she said nervously. Inside was a leather-bound photo album containing reprinted photographs of my childhood and family milestones, copies she had requested from relatives and friends to replace the originals that had disappeared during the chaos of the time. Lockout. "It's not the same as having the originals," she acknowledged, "but I thought maybe we could start rebuilding our history." The gesture moved me deeply. Not because it erased what had happened, but because it acknowledged the loss while offering a path forward. As spring turned to summer, our yard became a collaborative project. My mother's talent for gardening complemented my more practical landscaping skills. Working side by side, often in comfortable silence, we created a shared space that reflected both our individual tastes and our evolving relationship. On the anniversary of my father's death, we visited his grave together for the first time since the conflict began. Standing beside the granite headstone bearing his name, my mother finally spoke the words that had been building for months. "Michael would be so disappointed in how I treated our daughter," she said quietly. "But I think he would be proud of how you've handled everything, Jessica. Your strength, your compassion, despite what I did, that comes from him." "It comes from both of you," I replied, surprising myself with the realization that it was true. The mom who raised me wouldn't have done what happened last year. That was Richard's influence on someone vulnerable. The real you is the person who taught me to stand up for myself in the first place. We embraced there, among the quiet gravestones, not as the wounded and the wounder, but as two people who had survived a storm that nearly destroyed them both. That evening, sitting in the garden between our homes, I reflected on the journey we had navigated. The house I had grown up in now belonged to another family, but the sense of home, of belonging and connection, had not been lost, merely transformed. The legal battle that had seemed so devastating had actually freed both of us from Richard's influence and opened a path to healing that might otherwise have remained closed. The relationship between my mother and me would never be exactly what it was before. The wounds had left scars that would always be visible if you knew where to look. But in many ways, what had emerged from the ashes of betrayal was stronger because it was based on truth rather than obligation, on chosen forgiveness rather than assumed loyalty. Standing up for myself had been necessary and right. Taking half the house legally had protected me financially and emotionally. But choosing to extend compassion afterward had protected something equally valuable: my capacity for connection and my belief in the possibility of redemption. As the evening light faded, casting long shadows across our shared garden, I understood that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in winning the battle, but in what you choose to build after the fighting stops. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have offered your mother a second chance? Or maintain distance for your own protection? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, please like and subscribe to hear more about navigating difficult family dynamics and finding healing after betrayal. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the family we rebuild is stronger than the one we lose. I'm grateful for this community that allows us to share these deeply personal journeys together. ARO